leaving memories that become legend. Legend fades to myth. Even myth is long forgotten when the age that gave it birth comes again. In one age, called the Third Age by some, an age yet to come, an age long past, a wind rose in the great forest called Rain Wood. The wind was not the beginning. There are neither beginnings nor endings to the turning of the wheel of time, but it was a beginning. North and east the wind blew as the searing sun rose higher in a cloudless sky. North and east through parched trees with brown leaves and bare branches, through scattered villages where the air shimmered from the heat. The wind brought no relief, no hint of rain, much less snow. North and east it blew, past an ancient arch of finely worked stone that some said had been a gateway to a great city, and others a monument to some long-forgotten battle. Only weathered, illegible remnants of carving remained on the massive stones, mutely recalling the lost glories of storied Coromanda. A few wagons trundled by in sight of the arch along the Tarvalin Road, and folk afoot shielded their eyes from dust raised by hooves and wagon wheels, driven by the wind. Most had no idea where they were going, only that the world seemed to turn somersaults, all order ending where it was not gone already. Fear drove some on, while others were drawn by something they could not quite see and did not understand. Most of them were afraid too. Onward the wind traveled across the gray green river Aranon, heeling ships that still carried trade north and south, for there had to be trade even in these days, though none could be sure where it was safe to trade. East of the river, the forests began to thin, giving way eventually to low rolling hills covered in brown, tinder-dry grass and dotted sparsely with small clumps of trees. Atop one of those hills stood a circle of wagons, many with the canvas scorched or else completely burned away from the iron hoops. On a makeshift flagstaff, trimmed from a young tree, dead in the drought, and lashed to a bare wagon hoop for more height, waved a crimson banner, a black and white disk in its heart. The Banner of Light, some called it, or Althor's Banner. Others had darker names, and shivered as they spoke them in whispers. The wind shook the banner hard, and was gone quickly, as if glad to be away. Perone Barra sat on the ground with his broad back against a wagon wheel, wishing the wind lingered. It had been cooler for a moment, and the wind from the south had cleared the scent of death from his nostrils. A scent that reminded him where he was supposed to be, the last place he wanted to be. Much better here, inside the wagon circle, his back to the north, where he could forget after a fashion. The surviving wagons had been hauled up to the hilltop yesterday in the afternoon. Once men could find strength to do more than thank the life they still breathed. Now the sun climbed again, and the heat with it. Irritably, he scratched at his short curly beard. The more he sweated, the more it itched. Sweat rolled down the face of every man he could see, except the Aiel. And water lay nearly a mile away to the north now. But so did the horrors and the smells. Most considered it a fair trade. He should have been doing his duty, yet the touch of guilt did not move him. Today was High Chazaline, and back home in the Two Rivers there would be feasting all day and dancing all night. The day of reflection, when you were supposed to remember all the good things in your life, and anyone who voiced a complaint would find a bucket of water upended over his head to wash away bad luck. Not something anybody wanted when the weather was cold, as it should be. A bucket of water would be a pleasure now. For a man lucky to be alive, he found it remarkably hard to pull up any good thoughts. He had learned things about himself yesterday, or maybe it had been this morning, after it was all done. He could sense a few of the wolves still, a handful of those that survived, and were now on their way elsewhere, far from here, far from men. The wolves were still the talk of the camp, uneasy speculation over where they had appeared from and why. A few believed Brand had called them. Most thought the Aes Sedai had. The Aes Sedai did not say what they thought. No blame came from the wolves. What had happened had happened. But he could not match their fatalism. They had come because he called them. Shoulders wide enough to make him seem shorter than he was, slumped under the weight of responsibility. Now and then he heard other wolves that had not come speak with scorn to those that had. This was what came of mixing with the two legs. Nothing else could be expected. It was a strain to keep his thoughts to himself. He wanted to be home in the Two Rivers. No chance of that, perhaps ever again. He wanted to howl that the scornful ones were right. He wanted to be with his wife anywhere at all, and everything the way it was before. The chances of which seemed little better, maybe worse. Far more than the yearning for home, more even than the wolves, worry about Fail ate inside him like a ferret trying to burrow out of his middle. She had actually seemed glad to see him leave Cairhien. What was he to do about her? He could not think of words to describe how much he loved his wife and needed her, but she was jealous where she had no cause, hurt where he had done nothing, angry where he could not see why. He must do something, but what? The answer eluded him. Careful thought was all he had, while Fail was flashing quicksilver. The Aiel should put some clothes on them, Aram muttered primly, scowling at the ground. He squatted nearby, initially holding the reins of the bulgy gray gelding. He seldom went far from Perrin. The sword strapped to his back jarred with his green-striped tinker coat, hanging undone for the heat. A rolled kerchief tied around his forehead kept sweat from his eyes. Once Perrin had thought him almost too good-looking for a man. A bleak darkness had settled in him, though. Now he wore a scowl as often as not. It isn't decent, Lord Perrin. Perrin put aside thoughts of Fail reluctantly. With time, he could puzzle it out. He had to, somehow. It is their way, Aram. Aram grimaced, as if he might spit. Well, it isn't a decent way. It keeps them under control, I suppose. Nobody would run far and make trouble like that. But it isn't decent. There were Aiel all over the place, of course. Tall, aloof men in grays and browns and greens. Their only bit of color was a scarlet strip of cloth tied around their temples, with the black and white disc on their foreheads. Tiswayaman, they called themselves. Sometimes that word tickled the edge of his memory like a word he should know. Ask one of the Aielmen, and he looked as if you had babbled nonsense. But then they ignored the strips of cloth, too. No maiden of the spear wore the scarlet headband. Whether white-haired or looking barely old enough to leave her mother, every maiden stalked about giving the Siswayaman challenging stares that seemed somehow self-satisfied, while the men looked back flat-eyed, with the smell almost of hunger, a matter of jealousy by the scent of all of them, though over what, Perrin could not begin to imagine. Whatever it was not new, and it did not seem likely to come to A few of the wise ones were inside the wagons as well, in bulky skirts and white blouses, wearing their dark shawls in defiance of the heat, glittering bracelets and necklaces of gold and ivory making up for the plainness of the rest of their clothes. Some appeared amused by the maidens and the Siswayaman, and others exasperated. All of them, wise ones, maidens, and Siswayaman, ignored the Shaido the way Perrin would a stew or a rock. The Aiel had taken 200 or so Shaido prisoners yesterday, men and maidens, not many considering the numbers involved, and they moved about freely, in a manner of speaking. Perrin would have been a lot more comfortable had they been guarded and clothed. Instead, they fetched water and ran errands, naked as the day they were born. With other Aiel, they were meek as mice. Anyone else received a defiant stare for noticing that. Perrin was not the only one who tried not to notice. Aram not the only one to mutter. Many of the Two Rivers men in camp did one or both. A good many of the Carrienen nearly had apoplexy whenever they saw one of the Shido. The Mayenners just shook their heads as though it were all a joke, and ogled. They had as little shame as the Aiel, the Mayenners. Gaul explained it to me, Aaron. You know what a Gaishain is, don't you? About Giotto, and serving a year and a day and all that? The other man nodded. That was a good thing. Aaron did not know much himself. Gaul's explanations of Aiel ways often left him more confused. Gaul always thought it all self-evident. Well, Gaishain aren't allowed to wear anything one of the Algaid Siswai might wear. That means spear fighters, he added at Aram's questioning frown. Suddenly he realized he was looking straight at one of the Shido as she trotted in his general direction. A tall young woman, golden-haired and pretty, despite a long thin scar down her cheek, and other scars elsewhere. Very pretty, and very naked. Clearing his throat roughly, he pulled his eyes away. He could feel his face heating. Anyway, that is why they are the way they are. Gaishain wear white robes. They don't have any here. It's just their way. Burn Gaul and burn his explanations, he thought. They could cover them with something. Aaron Golden Eyes, said a woman's voice. Carahuen sends to know whether you wish water. Aram found in his squat, presenting his back to him. No, thank you. Aaron did not need to look up to know it was the golden-haired Shido woman. He kept peering off at nothing in another direction. Aiel had a peculiar sense of humor, and maidens of the spear, Carahuen was a maiden, had the most peculiar. They had quickly seen how the Wetlanders reacted to the Shido. They would have needed to be blind not to. And suddenly Gaishain were being sent to Wetlanders left and right, and Aiel all but rolling on the ground at the blushes and stammers, and even the shouting. He was sure that Carahuen and her friends were watching now. This was at least the 10th time one of the Gaishain women had been sent to ask him whether he wanted water or had a spare whetstone, or some such bloody fool thing. Abruptly, a thought.
Hey, Gear Changer, how you doing, bro?
Mayenners were seldom bothered this way.
Hope you're doing well today.
And plainly enjoyed looking, if not so openly as the Mayenners, and some of the older Two Rivers men. Should have known better.
Let's do another dab real quick for some
spurious
Fruity Pebbles.
Those who reacted the most, on the other hand, Carrienen, who had shouted the loudest about indecency, and 2 or 3 of the younger Two Rivers men, who stammered and blushed as if they were ready to melt, had been pestered until they fled the wagons entirely. With an effort, Perrin looked up at the Gaishain's face, at her eyes. Focus on her eyes, he thought frantically. They were green and large, and not at all meek. Her scent was pure fury. Thank Carahuen for me, and tell her you could oil my spare saddle if she doesn't mind. And I don't have a clean shirt. If she wouldn't mind you doing some laundry, she will not mind, the woman said in a tight voice, then turned and trotted off. Perrin whipped his eyes away, though the image did stay.
Hell yeah.
Like Aram,
I'm about to smoke when I have one rolled up.
You might just have stopped any more visitations. You would have to point this out to Aram and the Two Rivers men.
Hell yeah. It's good to see you too, Gear Changer.
What are we going to do about them, Lord Perrin? Still looking away, Aram no longer spoke of Gaishain. That is Rand's to decide, Perrin said slowly, satisfaction fading. It might be odd to think of people wandering about naked as a small problem. This was definitely a big one, and one he had been avoiding as hard as he had what lay to the north. On the far side of the wagon circle, nearly 24 women sat on the ground. All well dressed for travel, many wore silk, most with light linen dust cloaks, but not a bead of sweat showed on any face. 3 appeared young enough that he might have asked them for a dance before he married Fail. If they weren't Aes Sedai, anyway, he thought wryly. Once he had danced with an Aes Sedai and nearly swallowed his tongue when he realized who he swung about. And she had been a friend, if that word applied to Aes Sedai. How did Aes Sedai have to be for me? The others looked ageless, of course. Maybe in their 20s, maybe
Wrote
their 40s.
a little pinner for tonight.
Next, always uncertain. That was what their faces said, though several showed gray in their hair. You just could not tell with Aes Sedai. About anything. At least those are no danger.
Oh, down. That sucks. That sucks, Gear Changer.
The sisters a little apart from the rest. One wept, face on her knees. The other two stared haggardly at nothing, one of them plucking aimlessly at her skirt. They had been much the same since yesterday. At least none was screaming any longer. If Perrin had the straight of it, which he was not sure he did, they had been stilled somehow when Rand broke free. They would never channel the one power again. Aes Sedai was probably better. You would have expected the other Aes Sedai to comfort them, care for them somehow, but most ignored the three entirely, although a little too studied in looking anywhere and everywhere else.
Little toadstone.
For that matter, the Stilled Aes Sedai refused to acknowledge the rest either. In the beginning, at least, a few of the other sisters had approached, each by herself, calm to the eye, yet smelling sharply of aversion and reluctance. But they got nothing for their pains, not word or glance. None had gone near this morning. Perrin shook his head. The Aes Sedai seemed to do a lot of ignoring of what they did not want to admit. For instance, the black-coated men.
Must make sure they don't get like the resin on your hand or
for each sister,
resin on your lips from smoking it.
Stilled, and they never seemed to blink.
Like I was already starting to get from it.
The Aes Sedai looked past the Ashaman, or through them. He might as well not have existed. It was quite a trick. He could not make himself disregard the Ashaman, and he was not under their guard. They ranged from fuzz-cheeked boys to gray-haired, balding Gansers. And it was not their grim, high-collared black coats or the sword each wore to could channel, and somehow they were keeping the Aes Sedai from channeling. Then who could wield the one power? A thing of nightmares. Rand could, of course, but he was Rand, and the Dragon Reborn besides. These fellows made Perrin's hackles rise. The captain of his surviving warders sat some distance off, under their own guard. 30 or so of Lord Dobrain's armsmen in bell-shaped Carianan helmets, and as many Mayenna winged guards in red breastplates, each sharp-eyed as if guarding leopards. A good attitude under the circumstances. More warders than there were Aes Sedai. A number of the prisoners were Green Asha, apparently. More guards than warders. A good many more. And maybe few enough at that. You don't see any more grief than that. During the night, the warders had tried to break free. In truth, those outbreaks had been suppressed more by the Ashaman than by the Carianan or Mayenners.
That's definitely
none of the warders had been killed, but at least a dozen nursed broken bones. None of the sisters had yet been allowed to heal. If the Lord Dragon cannot make the decision, Aram said quietly, maybe it should be made by somebody else to protect him. Perrin gave him a decision. The sisters told them not to make another attempt, and they'll obey their Aes Sedai. Broken bones or no, unarmed as they were,
I feel you on that. Definitely not cheap.
The warders still looked like a wolf pack awaiting the lead wolf's command to attack. None would rest easy until his Aes Sedai was free. Maybe until all of the sisters were free. Aes Sedai and warders. A stack of well-aged oak ready for a flame. But even warders and Aes Sedai had proved no match for Ashaman. I did not mean the warders. Aram hesitated, then shuffled closer to Perrin and lowered his voice further, to a hoarse whisper. The Aes Sedai kidnapped the Lord Dragon. He can't trust them, not ever. But he won't do what he has to either. If they died. What are you saying? Baron almost choked as he sat bolt upright. Not for the first time he wondered whether there was any tinker left in the other man. They're helpless, Aram. Helpless women. They are Aes Sedai. Dark eyes met Perrin's golden stare levelly. They cannot be trusted, and they cannot be turned loose. How long can Aes Sedai be held against their will? They've been doing what they do far longer than the Ashaman. They must know more. They're a danger to the Lord Dragon and to you, Lord Perrin. I have seen them look at you. Across the wagon circle, the sisters were talking among themselves in whispers even Perrin could not hear.
That's crazy.
Mouths held close to ears. Now and again, one did look at him and Aram. At him, not Aram. He had caught a double handful of names: Nessun Behara, Arian Barolius, Katarine Aradn, Coirin Saildane, Sareen Nemdal, and Elza Penfell, Janine Pavlara, Beldine Nyram, Merith Ribbon. Those last were the young sisters, but young or ageless. They watched him with faces so serene, it seemed they had the upper hand despite the Ashaman. Defeating Aes Sedai was not easy. Making them admit defeat lay on the far side of impossible. He forced his hands to unknot and rest on his knees, giving an appearance of calm he was nowhere near feeling. They knew he was ta'veren, one of those few the pattern would shape itself around for a time. Worse, they knew he was tied to Rand in some way nobody understood, least of all himself or Rand. Or Mat. Mat was in that tangle too, another ta'veren, though neither of them as strongly as Rand. Given half a chance, those women would have him and Mat inside the White Tower as fast as they would Rand, tethered like goats until the lion came. And they had kidnapped Rand, mistreated him. Aram was right about one thing. They could not be trusted. But what Aram suggested, he would not, could not, countenance such a thing. The thought made him queasy. I'll hear no more of that, he growled. The one-time tinker opened his mouth, but Perrin cut him off. Not a word, Aram. Do you hear me? Not one word. As my Lord Perrin commands, Aram muttered, inclining his head. Perrin wished he could see the man's face. There was no anger in the smell of him, no resentment. That was the worst of it. There had been no anger sent even when Aram suggested murder. A pair of Two Rivers men climbed up on the wheels of the next wagon, peering across the wagon bed and down the hill toward the north. Each wore a bristling quiver on his right hip and a stout, long-bladed knife, almost a short sword, on his left. A good 300 men from home had followed Perrin here. He cursed the first to call him Lord Perrin, cursed the day he had stopped trying to quash it. Even with the rumors and noises usual in a camp this size, he had no trouble hearing the pair. Todd Alcar, a year younger than Perrin, let out a long breath as if seeing what lay below for the first time. Perrin could almost sense the lanky man's lantern jaw working. Todd's mother had willingly let him go, only for the honor of her son following Perrin Golden Eyes. A famous victory, Todd said finally. That's what we won. Wasn't it, Jundin? Grizzled, gnarled as an oak root, was one of the few older men among the 300. A better bow shot than anyone in the Two Rivers except Master Althor, and a better hunter than anyone at all, he was one of the Two Rivers' less distinguished residents. Jundin had not worked a day more than he had to since he was old enough to leave his father's farm. The forests and the hunt were all he cared about. That and drinking too much at feast days. Now he spat loudly. If you say so, boy. Was those bloody Ashaman wanted anyway. And welcome to it, I say. Too bad they don't take it and go someplace else to celebrate. They aren't so bad, Todd protested. I wouldn't mind being one myself. That sounded more boast and bluff than truth. Smelled it, too. Without looking, Perrin was sure he was licking his lips. Likely Todd's mother had used tales of men who could channel to frighten him not so many years ago. I mean to say Rand. That is, the Dragon Reborn. It still sounds odd, doesn't it? Randall Thor being the Dragon Reborn and all? Todd laughed, a short, uneasy sound. Well, he can channel, and it doesn't seem so...
hell yeah, Gear Changer.
I mean...
You have a good rest of your evening or night.
Besides...
But I definitely appreciate you stopping by and showing some love, bro.
He smelled afraid now. Jondon, what are we going to do? I mean, Aes Sedai prisoners? The older man spat again, louder than before.
Sorry, I'm a little distracted. I'm doing a little bit of a game right now.
Said what he thought, no matter who
and
heard,
listening to the book, so I tend to get distracted sometimes.
Better for us if they'd all died yesterday, boy. We'll pay for that.
Well, this one is at Raid of Shadow Legends.
Perrin shut out the rest. No easy task with his ears. First Aram, and now Jondon and Todd, if not so directly. Burn Jondon. No, the man might make Mat look industrious, but if he spoke it, others thought it. No Two Rivers man would willingly harm a woman, but who else wished the Aes Sedai prisoners dead? And who might try to achieve the wish? He scanned the wagon circle uneasily. The thought that he might have to protect the Aes Sedai prisoners was not pleasant, but he did not shirk it. He had little fondness for any Aes Sedai, least of all for these. But he had grown up in the unspoken certainty that a man would put himself at risk to protect a woman as far as she allowed. Whether he liked her or even knew her was beside the point. True, an Aes Sedai could tie any man she chose into a knot 9 ways from next feast day, but cut off from the power, they became like anyone else. That was the struggle whenever he looked at them. 24 Aes Sedai. 24 women who might not know how to defend themselves without the power. For a bit he studied the Ashaman guards, everyone wearing a face like grim death, except the 3 overseeing the stilled women. They tried to appear as somber as the rest, but under the attempt lay something else. Satisfaction, maybe. If only he was close enough to catch a scent of them. Any Aes Sedai was a threat to the Ashaman. Perhaps the reverse was true, too. Perhaps they would only still them. From the little he had picked up, stilling an Aes Sedai amounted to a killing that just took a few years for the corpse to lie down. Whatever the case, he decided reluctantly he had to leave the Ashaman to Rand. They spoke only to each other and the prisoners, and Perrin doubted they would listen to anyone but Rand. The question was, what would Rand say? And what could Perrin do if he said the wrong thing? Putting that problem aside, he scratched his beard with one finger. The Karianen were too nervous about Aes Sedai to consider harming them, and the Maenners too respectful, but he would keep an eye on them anyway. Who would have thought Jondon would go as far as he had? Among the Karianen or Maenners, he possessed some influence, though it would surely vanish if they once thought. He was really just a blacksmith, after all. That left the Aiel. Perrin sighed. He was not certain how much influence even Rand truly had with the Aiel. It was difficult picking out individual scents with so many people around, but he had grown used to telling as much by smells as by what his eyes told him. The Siswayaman, who came close enough, smelled calm but alert, a smooth, strong scent. They hardly appeared to notice the Aes Sedai. The maiden's aromas were spiky with suppressed fury, and grew spikier when they looked at the prisoners. The wise ones? Every wise one who had come here from Karian was able to channel, though none had become his face. He supposed they used the one power too seldom. Still, smooth-cheeked like Adara, or as leathery-faced as white-haired Soralia, they carried themselves with a self-possession easily matching the Aes Sedai's. Graceful women for the most part, most of them tall, as nearly all Aiel were, they seemed to ignore the sisters completely. Soralea's eyes passed across the prisoners without pausing, and she went right on talking softly to Adara and another wise one, a lean, yellow-haired woman he did not know by name. If only he could make out what they were saying. They walked by, not a line changing on those three unruffled faces, but their scents were another matter. When Soralea's gaze swept over the Aes Sedai, the smell of her went cold and distant, grim and purposeful. And as she spoke to the other two, their scents changed to match hers. A fine bloody stew, he growled. Trouble? Aram asked, sitting up straighter on his heels, right hand poised to dart for the wolf-head pommeled sword hilt, jutting above his shoulder. He had become very good with that sword in a very short time, and he was never loath to use it. There's no trouble, Aram. That was not quite a lie. Jolted out of his glum brooding, Perrin really looked at the others for the first time. At all of them together. He did not like what he saw, and the Aes Sedai were only part. Cairhienin and Mayenners watched Aiel suspiciously, which was no more than the Aiel's returned suspicion, especially toward the Cairhienin. No real surprise there. Aiel did have a certain reputation, after all, for being none too friendly to anyone born this side of the spine of the world, Cairhienin least of all. Simple truth was, Aiel and Cairhienin hated each other about as hard as it was possible to hate. Neither side had really put their enmity aside. The best that could be said was that it was on a loose leash. Yet up to now, he had been convinced they would hold it in. For Rand's sake, if no other reason. A mood hung in the camp, though, a tension that had wound everyone tight. Rand was free now, and temporary alliances were just that, after all. Aiel had to be for Cairhienin. Cairhienin defended their swords. So did the Mayenners. They had no quarrel with the Aiel, and never fought the Aiel war when everybody had. But if it came to a fight, there was little doubt which side they would be on. The Two Rivers men, too, probably. The dark mood had settled deepest in the Ashaman and the Wise Ones, though. The black-coated men paid no more heed to the Maidens and the Siswayaman than to Cairhienin or Mayenners or Two Rivers men. But they studied the Wise Ones with faces almost as dark as those directed at the Aes Sedai. Very likely they made small distinction between one woman who could wield the power and another. Any could be an enemy and dangerous. 13 together were deadly dangerous, and there were better than 90 Wise Ones in the camp or nearby. Fewer than half the number of Ashaman, but still enough if they chose. Women who could channel, yet they seemed to follow Rand. They seemed to follow Rand, yet they were women who could channel. The Wise Ones looked at Rand only a trifle less coldly than they did the Aes Sedai. The Ashaman were men who could channel, but they followed Rand. They followed Rand, but Rand was a special case. According to Gaul, his channeling was not mentioned in the prophecies about their Kara-Karn, but the Aiel seemed to pretend that inconvenient fact did not exist. The Ashaman were not in those prophecies at all, though. It must be like discovering you had a pride of rabid lions fighting on your side.
Excuse me.
How long will they remain loyal? Maybe it would be better to put them down now. His head fell back against the wagon wheel, eyes closed, and his chest heaved in silent, mirthless laughter. Think of the good things on High Chazaleen. Burn me, he thought wryly. I should have gone with Rand. No, it was best to know, and better soon than late. But what in the light was he to do? If the Aiel and the Cairhienin and Mayenners turned on one another, or worse, the Ashaman and the Wise Ones, a barrel full of snakes, and the only way to find out which were vipers was to put your hand in. Light, I wish I was home with Aiel and the forge to work, and nobody calling me. Lord Perrin, you didn't say whether you wanted step or stair, so I saddled. At Perrin's golden-eyed glare, Kenly Merrin shied back into the dun stallion he was leading. Perrin made a soothing gesture. not Kenley's fault. What could not be mended had to be endured. Easy, lad. You did right. Stepper will do just fine. You chose well. He hated speaking to Kenley that way. Short and stocky, Kenley was barely old enough to marry or leave home, and certainly not old enough for the patchy beard he was trying to cultivate in imitation of Perrin. Yet he had fought Trollocs at Emmons Field and done well yesterday. But he grinned broadly at praise from Lord Perrin Bloody Golden Eyes. Rising, Perrin took his axe from where he had propped it under the wagon, out of sight, and for a little while out of mind, and thrust the haft through the loop on his belt. A heavy half-moon blade balanced by a thick curving spike, the thing made for no other purpose than killing. The axe haft felt too familiar to his hands for comfort. Did he even remember what a good forge hammer felt like? There were other things besides Lord Perrin that it might be too late to change. A friend had once told him to keep the axe until he began to like using it. The thought made him shiver in spite of the heat. He swung into Stepper's saddle, shadowed by Aram with the gray, and sat facing south into the wagon circle. At least half again as tall as even the tallest of the Aiel, Loyal was just stepping carefully over crossed wagon tongues. With the size of him, he did look as though he might break one of the heavy wooden shafts with a heedless step. As usual, he had a book in his hand, a thick finger marking his place. The capacious pockets of his long coat bulged with more. He had spent the morning in a tiny clump of trees he called restful and shady, but whatever the shade among those trees, the heat was affecting him too. He looked tired, and his coat was undone, his shirt unlaced, and his boots rolled down below his knees. Or maybe it was more than the heat. Just inside the wagons, Loyal paused, peering at the Aes Sedai and the Ashaman, and his tufted ears quivered uneasily. Eyes big as teacups rolled toward the wise ones, and his ears vibrated again. Ogier was sensitive to the mood of a place. When he saw Perrin, Loyal came striding across the camp. Sitting his saddle, Perrin was 2 or 3 hands shorter than Loyal standing.
Perrin,
Loyal whispered.
This is all wrong. It isn't right. And it is dangerous besides.
For an Ogier, it was a whisper. He sounded like a bumblebee the size of a mastiff. Some of the Aes Sedai turned their heads. Could you speak a little louder? Perrin said, almost under his breath. I think somebody in Andor didn't hear. In the west of Andor. Loyal looked startled, then grimaced, long eyebrows brushing his cheeks.
I do know how to whisper, you know.
This time it was unlikely anyone could hear clearly more than 3 paces away or so.
What are we going to do, Perrin? It is wrong halting the Aes Sedai against their will. Wrong, and wrong-headed too. I have said that before, and I will again. And that isn't even the worst. The field one spark, and this place will erupt like a wagon load of fireworks. Does Rand know about this?
I don't know, Perrin said to both questions, and after a moment the Ogier nodded reluctantly.
Someone has to know. Someone has to do something.
Loyal looked north, over the wagons behind Perrin, and Perrin knew there was no putting it off longer. Unwillingly, he turned Stepper. He would rather have worried over Aes Sedai and Ashaman and Wise Ones till his hair fell out. But what had to be done had to be done. Think of the good on High Chazzaleen. At first, Perrin did not look downslope toward where he would ride, where he should have gone with Rand this morning. Instead, he sat his saddle at the edge of the wagons and sent his eyes anywhere else, though the view everywhere. It was like being hit in the belly with a hammer. Hammerstroke. 19 fresh graves atop a squat hill to the east. 19 Two Rivers men who would never see home again. A blacksmith seldom had to see people die because of his decisions. At least the Two Rivers men had obeyed his orders. There would have been more graves otherwise. Hammerstroke. Rectangles of newly turned earth blanketed the next slope over from that as well. Near to 100 Mayenners and more Carianan, who had come to Dumais Wells to die. Never mind causes or reasons, they had followed Pere-Nebara. Hammerstroke. The ridge face to the west seemed solid graves, maybe 1,000 or more. 1,000 Aiel, buried standing upright to face each sunrise. 1,000. Some were maidens. The men tied his stomach into knots. Women made him want to sit down and cry. He tried telling himself that they had all chosen to be here, that they had had to be here. Both things were true, but he had given the orders, and that made the responsibility for those graves his. Not Rand's, not the Aes Sedai's. His. The living Aiel had only stopped singing over their dead a short while ago, haunting songs, sung in parts that lingered in the mind. Life is a dream that knows no shade. Life is a dream of pain and woe. A dream from which we pray to wake, a dream from which we wake and go. Who would sleep when a new dawn waits? Who would sleep when the sweet winds blow? A dream must end when a new day comes. This dream from which we wake and go. They appeared to find comfort in those songs. He wished he could too, but as far as he could see, the Aiel truly did not seem to care whether they lived or died, and that was mad. Any sane man wanted to live. Any sane man would run as far as he could from a battle, run as hard as he could. Stepper tossed his head, nostrils flaring at the smells from below, and Perrin patted the Dun's neck. Aram was grinning as he looked at what Perrin tried to block out. Loyal's face had so little expression it might have been carved from wood. His lips moved slightly, and Perrin thought he heard,
"Light, let me never see the like again."
Drawing a deep breath, he made his eyes follow theirs to Dumais Wells. In some ways, it was not as bad as the grave. He'd known some of those people since he was a child. But it all crashed down on him at once anyway, like the scent in his nose made solid and smashing in between the eyes. The memories he wanted to forget came rushing back. Dumais Wells had been a killing ground, a dying ground, but now it was worse. Less than a mile away, the charred remains of wagons stood around a small copse of trees, nearly hiding the low stone copings of the wells. And surrounding that, a seething sea of black, vultures and ravens and crows in tens of thousands, swirling up in waves and settling down again, concealing the broken earth, for which Perrin was more than grateful. The Ashaman's methods had been brutal, destroying flesh and ground with equal impartiality. Too many Shaido had died to bury in less than days, even had anyone cared to bury them. So the vultures gorged, and the ravens, and the crows. The dead wolves were down there too. He had wanted to bury them, but that was not the wolves' way. 3 Aes Sedai corpses had been found, their channeling unable to save them from spears and arrows in the madness of battle, and 6 dead warders too. They were buried in the clearing near the wells. The birds were not alone with the dead, far from it. Black-feathered waves rose around Lord Dobraine Tabroin, and over 200 of his mounted Carianan armsmen, and Lieutenant Javier Nurella, with all that remained of his Mayenners, aside from the guards and the warders. Khan, with 2 white diamonds on blue, picked out the Carianan officers, all but Dobraine himself, and the Mayenners' red armor and red streamered lances made a brave show amid the carnage. But Dubrain was not the only one who held a cloth to his nose. Here and there, a man leaned from the saddle, trying to empty his stomach, already emptied earlier. Mazrim Taim, almost as tall as Rand, was afoot in his black coat, with the blue and gold dragons climbing the sleeves, and maybe 100 more of the Ashaman. Some of them heaved up their bellies, too. There were maidens by the score, more Siswayaman and Tarienan and Mayenners and Ashaman combined, and several dozen wise ones to boot. All supposedly in case the Shido returned, or perhaps in case some of the dead were only shamming. Though Perrin thought anyone who pretended of being a corpse here would soon go insane. All centered around Rand. Perrin should have been down there with the Two Rivers men. Rand had asked for them, spoken about trusting men from home, but Perrin had made no promises. They'll have to settle for me, and late, he thought. In a little bit, when he managed to steel himself to the butcher's yard below. Only butcher knives did not mow down people, and they were tidier than axes, tidier than vultures. The black-coated Ashaman faded into the sea of birds, death swallowed by death, and ravens and crows surging up hid the others. But Rand stood out in the tattered white shirt he had been wearing when rescue came. Though perhaps he needed deliverance by that time. The sight of Min, close beside Rand in pale red coat and snug breeches, made Perrin grimace. That was no place for her, or anyone. But she stayed closer to Rand since the rescue than even Taim did. Somehow Rand had managed to free both himself and her well before Perrin, or even the Ashaman. Perrin suspected she saw Rand's presence as the only real safety. Sometimes, as he rode across that charnel ground, Rand patted Min's arm or bent his head as if speaking to her, but not with his main attention. Dark clouds rolled around them, elsewhere, the vultures giving ground reluctantly, some refusing to take wing, extending their necks and squawking defiantly as they now and then bending over a corpse. Sometimes fire darted from his hands to strike down vultures that did not give way. Every time, Nandera, who led the maidens, or Sulin, her second, argued with him. Sometimes wise ones did too, the way they tugged at the body's coat as if demonstrating something. And Rand would nod and move on. Not without backward glances, though, and only until another body caught his attention. "What is he doing?" demanded a haughty voice at Perrin's knee. Lysenko, statuesque and elegant in a green silk riding dress and thin linen.
Hey, Bill the Trot, how you doing, bro?
Karuna Nachaman was sister to
Hope you're
King
doing
Python
well.
of Arafel, and a powerful noble in her own right, and becoming Aes Sedai had done nothing to dampen her manner. Trapped in what he was watching, he had not heard her approach. Why is he doing that?
Definitely appreciate you
He
stopping
should
by.
Not all the Aes Sedai in the camp were prisoners, though those who were not had been keeping out of sight since yesterday, talking among themselves, Perrin suspected, and trying to figure out what had happened at the last. Maybe trying to figure out some way around it. Now they were out in force. Vera Harkin, another Green, stood at Karuna's shoulder, a farm wife by looks despite her ageless face and fine woolen dress, but every scrap as proud as Karuna in her own way. This farm wife would tell a king to scrape his boots before coming into her house and be shocked about it. She and Karuna together led the sisters who had come to demise Wells with Baron, or perhaps passed leadership back and forth between them. It was not exactly clear, which was hardly unusual with Aes Sedai. The other 7 stood in a covey not far away, or maybe in a pride, lionesses, not quail by their air of being in charge. Their warders were arrayed behind them, and if the sisters were all outward serenity, the warders made no bones of their feelings. They were disparate men, some in those color-shifting cloaks that seemed to make parts of them disappear, but whether short or tall, thick or thin, just standing there, they looked like violence on a frayed leash.
My dog's over here snoring.
Perrin knew 2 of those women well.
At least
Baron
the little
Mathley
one is.
and Alana Mosvani. Short and stout, and almost motherly at times in a distracted way, when she was not studying you like a bird studying a worm, Varen was brown Aja. Alana, slim and darkly pretty, though a little haggard around the eyes of late for some reason, was green. Altogether, 5 of the 9 were green. Once, some time ago, Varen had told him not to trust Alana too far, and he more than took her at her word. Nor did he trust any of the others, including Varen. Neither did Rand, for all they had fought on his side yesterday, and despite what had happened at the end, which Perrin still was not sure he believed, even though he had seen it. A good dozen Ashaman lounged by a wagon about 20 paces from the sisters. A cocky fellow named Charles Gedwin had charge of them this morning, a hard-faced man who swaggered standing still. All wore a pin in the shape of a silver sword on their tall coat collars, and 4 or 5 besides Gedwin had a dragon in gold and red enamel fastened on the other side. Perrin supposed that had to do with rank in some way. He had seen both on some of the other Ashaman. Not precisely guards, they managed to be wherever Karuna and the others were, just taking their ease and keeping a sharp eye open. Not that the Aes Sedai took any notice, not that you could see. Even so, the sisters smelled wary and puzzled and infuriated. Part of that had to be because of the Ashaman. Well? Karuna's dark eyes flashed impatience. He doubted that many people kept her waiting. I don't know, he lied, patting Stepper's neck again. Rand doesn't tell me everything. He understood a little, he thought he did, but he had no intention of telling anyone. That was Rand's to reveal, if he chose. Every body that Rand looked at belonged to a maiden. Perrin was convinced of it. A Shido maiden without a doubt, but he was not sure how much difference that made to Rand. Last night he had walked away from the wagons to be by himself, and as the sound of men laughing, because they were alive, faded behind him, he found Rand. The dragon reborn who made the world tremble, sitting on the ground, alone in the dark, his arms wrapped around himself, rocking back and forth. To Perrin's eyes, the moon was nearly as good as the sun, but right then he wished for pitch blackness. Rand's face was drawn and twisted, the face of a man who wanted to scream, or maybe weep, and was fighting it down with every scrap of his fiber. Whatever trick the Aes Sedai knew to keep the heat from touching them, Rand and the Ashaman knew too, but he was not using it now. The night's heat would have done for a more than warm summer day, and sweat slid down Rand's cheeks as much as Perrin's. He did not look around, though Perrin's boots rustled loudly in the dead grass. Yet he spoke hoarsely, still rocking. 151, Perrin. 151 maidens died today. For me. I promised them, you see. Don't argue with me. Shut up. Go away. Despite his sweat, Rand shivered. Not you, Perrin. Not you. I have to keep my promises, you see. Have to, no matter how it hurts. But I have to keep my promise to myself, too. No matter how it hurts. Perrin tried not to think about the fate of men who could channel. The lucky ones died before they went mad. The unlucky died after. Whether Rand was lucky or unlucky, everything rested on him. Everything. Rand, I don't know what to say, but... Rand seemed not to hear. Back and forth he rocked. Back and forth. Isan, of the Jara Sept of the Charina Hill. She died for me today. Juanda of the Bridge Miagoma. She died for me today. Ajarin of the Shilan Daraim. There had been nothing for it but to settle on his heels and listen to Rand recite all 151 names in a voice like pain stretched to breaking. Listen and hope Rand was holding on to sanity. Whether or not Rand was still completely sane, though, if a maiden who came to fight for him had been missed down there somehow, Perrin was sure that not only would she be buried decently with the others on the ridge, There would be 152 names in that list. And that was none of Karuna's business. Not that, or Baron's doubts. Rand had to stay sane, or sane enough anyway. And that was that. Light sent it so. And the light burned me for thinking it so coldly, Baron thought. From the corner of his eye, he saw her full mouth tighten momentarily. She liked not knowing everything about as well as being made to wait. She would have been beautiful in a grand sort of manner, except that hers was a face used to getting what it wanted. Not petulant, just absolutely certain that whatever she wanted was right and proper and must be. With so many crows and ravens in one place, there were certainly hundreds, perhaps thousands, ready to report what they've seen to a murderer. She made no effort to mask her irritation. She sounded as though he had brought every bird there himself. In the borderlands, we kill them on sight. You have men, and they have bows. It was true. A raven or crow was all too likely to be a spy for the Shadow. But disgust welled up in him. Disgust and weariness. To what point? With that many birds, the two Riversmen and the Aiel could shoot every arrow they had, and spies would still report. Most times there was no way to tell whether the bird you killed was the spy or the one that flew away. Hasn't there been enough killing? There will be more soon enough. Light Woman, even the Ashaman are sated. Eyebrows rose among the onlooking clutch of sisters. No one spoke to Aes Sedai that way. Not a king or a queen. Vera gave him a look that said she was considering hauling him out of the saddle and boxing his ears. Still peering toward the shambles below, Karuna smoothed her skirts, her face coldly determined. Loyal's ears trembled. He had a deep but uneasy respect for Aes Sedai. Close to twice as tall as most of the sisters, sometimes he behaved as though one might step on him without noticing if he got in her way. Perrin gave Karuna no chance to speak. Give an Aes Sedai a finger, and she took your whole arm. Unless she decided to take more. You've been staying clear of me, but I have a few things to say to you. You disobeyed orders yesterday. If you want to call it changing the plan, he pushed on when she opened her mouth, then call it that. If you think that makes it better. She and the other 8 had been told to stay with the Wise Ones, well back from the actual fighting, guarded by the two Riversmen and the Mayenners. Instead, they had plunged right into the thick of it, wading in where men were trying to cut one another into dog meat with swords and spears. You took Javi and Narella with you, and half the Mayenners died for it. You don't go your own way with no regard anymore. I won't see men die because you suddenly think you see a better way, and the Dark One take what everyone else thinks. Do you understand me? Are you finished, farm boy? Karuna's voice was dangerously calm. The face she turned up to him might have been carved from some dark ice, and she reeked of affront. Standing on the ground, she somehow made it seem that she was looking down at him. Not an Aes Sedai trick, that. He had seen Fail do it. He suspected most women knew how. I will tell you something, though the meanest intelligence should be able to reason it out. By the 3 oaths, no sister may use the one power as a weapon except against shadow spawn, or in defense of her life, or that of her warders, or another sister. We could have stood where you would have had us, and watched until Tarmon Gayton without ever being able to do anything effective. Not until we were in danger ourselves. I do not like having to explain my actions, farm boy. Do not make me do it again. Do you understand? Loyal's ears wilted, and he stared straight ahead so hard that it was plain he wished he were anywhere but here, even with his mother, who wanted to marry him off. Aram's mouth hung open, and he always tried to pretend Aes Sedai did not impress him at all. Jondin and Todd climbed down from their wagon wheel just a touch too casually. Jondin managed to stroll away, but Todd ran, looking back over his shoulder. Her explanation sounded reasonable. It was probably... No. By another of the oaths, it was the truth. There were loopholes, though, like not speaking the whole truth, or talking around it. The sisters might well have put themselves in danger so they could use the power as a weapon, but Perrin would eat his boots if they had not also been thinking they could reach Rand before anybody else. What would have happened then was anyone's guess, but he was certain their plan did not include anything like what actually happened.
He's coming,
Boyle said suddenly.
Look, Rand is coming.
Dropping to a whisper, he added,
Be careful,
for Ogier. Karuna probably heard quite clearly, and maybe Bera, but certainly no one besides.
I can't swear anything to you.
His voice went back to its normal boom.
Do you think he might talk to me about what went on inside the camp? For my book?
He was writing a book about the Dragon Reborn, or at least taking notes for one.
I really didn't see much once the fighting began.
He had been at Perrin's side in the thick of it, wielding an axe with a haft nearly as long as he was tall. It was hard to take note of much else when you were trying to stay alive. If you listened to Loyal, you would think he was always somewhere else when things became dangerous.
Do you think he might, Karuna Sedai?
Karuna and Bera exchanged looks, then without a word glided across the ground to Varen and the others. Peering after him, Loyal heaved a sigh. A wind through caverns.
You really should have a care, Perrin, he breathed. You're always so hasty with your tongue.
He sounded like a bumblebee the size of a cat instead of a mastiff. Perrin thought he might learn to whisper yet, if they spent enough time around Aes Sedai. He motioned the Ogier to be quiet, though, so he could listen. The sisters began talking right away, but not a sound reached Perrin's ears. Clearly they had erected a barrier with the one power. Clear to the Ashaman as well. They went from lounging to up on their toes in a heartbeat, every line of them focused on the sisters. Nothing said they had taken hold of Saidin, the male half of the true source, but Perrin would have wagered Stepper they had. By Gedwin's angry sneer, he was ready to use it too. Whatever obstruction the Aes Sedai had raised, they must have dropped it. They folded their hands, turning to look down the slope in silence. Glances passed among the Ashaman, and finally Gedwin waved them back to apparent indolence. He looked disappointed. Growling irritably, Perrin turned back to look beyond the wagons. Rand was strolling up the slope with Min on his arm, patting her hand and talking with her. Once he threw back his head and laughed, and she ducked hers to do the same, brushing back dark ringlets that hung to her shoulders. You might have thought him a countryman out with his girl, except that he had belted on his sword, and sometimes he ran his hand down the long hilt. And except for Taim right at his other shoulder, and the wise ones following almost as close behind, and the rings of maidens and Siswayaman, Kyrienin and Mayenners that completed the procession. What a relief that he would not have to ride down into that shambles after all. But he needed to warn Rand about all the tangled enmities he had seen this morning. What would he do if Rand did not listen? Rand had changed since leaving the Two Rivers, most of all since being kidnapped by Qarvin and that lot. No. He had to be sane. When Rand and Min entered the wagon circle, most of the procession remained outside, but they hardly came alone, but with quite an assembly in its own right. Taim shadowed Rand, of course, dark and slightly hook-nosed, and what parents supposed most women would consider good-looking. A number of the maidens had certainly given him second looks, and third. They were forward about that sort of thing. As Taim stepped inside, he glanced to Gedwin, who shook his head just a hair. A grimace flashed across Taim's face, gone as soon as it appeared. Nandera and Sualin were right at Rand's heels, equally, of course, and Perrin wondered they did not bring 20 more maidens. They hardly seemed to let Rand bathe without maidens guarding the tub, that Perrin could see. He did not understand why Rand put up with it. Each had her shufa draped around their shoulders, bearing short hair cut with a tail at the back. Nandera was a sinewy woman, hair more gray than yellow, but her tough features managed to be handsome, if not beautiful. Sulin, wiry, scarred, leathery, and white-haired, made Nandera look pretty and almost soft. They glanced at the Ashaman, too, without exactly seeming to, then scanned both groups of Aes Sedai just as circumspectly. Nandera's fingers flashed maiden hand talk. Not for the first time, Perrin wished he could understand it. But a maiden would give up the spear to marry a toad before teaching their hand talk to a man. A maiden Perrin had not noticed, sitting on her heels against a wagon a few paces from Gedwyn, answered the same way, and so did another who until that moment had been playing at cat's cradle with the spear sister near the prisoners. Amis brought the wise ones in and took them aside to confer with Sorlia and a few of the others who had stayed inside the wagons. Despite a face too young for her waist-long white hair, Amis was an important woman, second among the wise ones to Sorlia. They used no one-power tricks to shield their talk, but 7 or 8 maidens immediately encircled them and began singing softly to themselves. Some sat, some stood, some squatted on their heels, each by herself, and all happenstance. If you were a fool. It seemed to Perrin that he sighed a great deal since he became mixed up with Aes Sedai and wise ones. Maidens, too. Women in general just seemed to give him fits of late. Dobrain and Avian, leading their horses and minus their soldiers, brought up the rear. Avian had finally seen a battle. Perrin wondered whether he would be so eager to see the next. About the same age as Perrin, he did not look as young today as the day before yesterday. Dobrain, with the front of his long, mostly gray hair shaved in the style of Carianan soldiers, definitely was not young. And yesterday, definitely, had not been his first battle, yet the truth was he looked older too, and worried. So did Avian. Their eyes sought out Perrin. Another time, he would have waited to see what they wanted to talk about, but now he slipped from his saddle, tossed Stepper's reins to Aram, and went to Rand. Others were there ahead of him. Only Sulin and Nandera held their silence. Karuna and Bera had moved the moment Rand stepped inside the wagons, and as Perrin approached, Karuna was saying grandly to Rand, "You refused healing yesterday, but anyone can see you are still in pain, even if Alana was not ready to leap out of her." She cut off as Bera touched her arm, but she picked up again, almost without pause. "Perhaps you are ready to be healed now?" That had the sound of, "Perhaps you have come to your full senses?" "The matter of the Aes Sedai must be settled without any more delay, Karakan," Amis said formally, right atop Karuna. "They should be given into our care, Rand al'Thor," Sorlia added at the same time that Taim spoke. "The Aes Sedai problem does need to be settled, my Lord Dragon. My Ashaman know how to handle them. They can be held at the Black Tower easily." Dark, slightly tilted eyes flickered toward Karuna and Bera, and Perrin realized with a shock that Taim meant all the Aes Sedai, not just those who were prisoners now. For that matter, though Amis and Sorlia frowned at Taim, the looks they directed at the 2 Aes Sedai meant the same. Karuna smiled at Taim, at the wise ones, a thin smile to fit her lips. It was maybe a fraction harder when directed at the man in the black coat, but she seemed not to realize his intent yet. It was enough that he was who he was, what he was. "Under the circumstances," she said coolly, "I am certain that Coirin Sedai and the others will give me their parole. You have no more need to worry." The others spoke all at once. "These women have no honor," Amis said contemptuously, and this time it was clear she included all of them. "How could their parole mean anything? They are Tung," Sorlia said in a grim voice, as though pronouncing sentence. And Bera frowned at her. Perrin thought there was something in the old tongue. Again, the word seemed almost something he should recognize, but he did not know why it should make the Aes Sedai scowl, or why Sulin should suddenly nod agreement with the wise one, who went on like a boulder rumbling downhill. They deserve no better than any other.
My Lord Dragon,
Taim said, as if belaboring the obvious.
Surely you want the Aes Sedai, all of them, in charge of those you trust. Those you know can deal with them, and who better? Enough!
Rand shouted. They fell silent as one, but their reactions were very different. Taim's features went blank, though he smelled of fury. Amis and Sorlia exchanged glances. Leah exchanged glances and adjusted their shawls in near unison. Their scents were identical too, and matched their faces in pure determination.
Right back, everyone.
They wanted what they wanted, and intended to have it, Karakan or no. Looks passed between Karuna and Bera as well, speaking such volumes that Perrin wished he could read them the way his nose read scent. His eyes saw two serene Aes Sedai in command of themselves, and anything else they wished to be in command of. His nose smelled two women who were anxious and more than a little afraid. Of Taim, he was sure. They still seemed to think they could deal with Rand one way or another, and with the wise ones. But Taim and the Ashaman put the fear of the light into them. Min tugged at Rand's shirt sleeve. She had been studying everybody at once, and the scent of her was almost as worried as the sisters. He patted her hand while glaring hard at everyone else, including Perrin when he opened his mouth. Everybody in the camp was watching, from the Two Rivers men to the Aes Sedai prisoners, though only a few Aiel stood close enough to hear anything. People might watch Rand, but they tended to stay clear of him too, if they could. The wise ones will take charge of the prisoners, Rand said at last, and Sorlia suddenly smelled so satisfied that Perrin knuckled his nose vigorously. Taim shook his head in exasperation, but Rand rounded on him before he could speak. He tucked a thumb behind the buckle of his sword belt, a dragon etched and gilded, and his knuckles were white from gripping. His other hand worked on the dark boar hide of his sword hilt. The Ashaman are supposed to train and recruit, not stand guard, especially on Aes Sedai. Perrin's hackles stirred as he realized what aroma wafted from Rand when he looked at Taim. Hatred, touched with fear. Light, he had to be sane. Taim gave a short, reluctant nod. As you command, my Lord Dragon. Min glanced uneasily at the black-throated man and moved closer to Rand. Karuna smelled of relief, but with one last glance at Bera, she drew herself up in stubborn certainty. These Aiel women are quite worthy. Some might have done well had they come to the tower, but you cannot simply hand Aes Sedai over to them. It is unthinkable. Bera Sedai and I will... Rand raised a hand, and her words stopped in their tracks. Maybe it was his stare, like blue-gray stone. Or maybe it was what showed clearly through his torn sleeve, one of the red and gold dragons that wound around his neck. The dragon. Did you swear fealty to me? Karuna's eyes popped as though something had struck her in the pit of her stomach. After a moment, she nodded, however unwillingly. She looked as disbelieving now as she had the day before, when she knelt down there by the wells at battle's end and swore beneath the light and by her hope of salvation and rebirth to obey the dragon reborn and serve him until the last battle had come and gone. Perrin understood her shock. Even without the 3 oaths, had she denied it, he would have doubted his own memories. 9 Aes Sedai, on their knees, faces aghast at the words coming out of their mouths, reeking of disbelief. Right now, Bera's mouth was puckered up as though she had bitten a bad plum. An Aielman joined the small group, a tall man about the same height as Rand, with a weathered face and touches of gray in his dark red hair, who nodded to Perrin and touched Amisa's hand lightly. She might have pressed his hand for a moment in return. Ruark was her husband, but that was about as much affection as Aiel displayed in front of others. He was also clan chief of the Tardar Aiel. He and Gaul were the only 2 men who did not wear the Siswayaman headband. And since last night, he and 1,000 spears had been out scouting in force. A blind man in another country could have sensed the temper around Rand, and Ruark was no fool.
Is this the right moment, Randolthor?
When Rand motioned him to speak, he went on.
The Shido dogs are still fleeing east as fast as they can. I saw men with green coats on horses to the north, but they avoided us. And you said to let them go unless they gave trouble. I think they are hunting any Aes Sedai who escaped. There were several women with them.
Cold blue eyes glanced at the two Aes Sedai, Anvil Flat and Anvil Hard. Once, Ruark had walked lightly around Aes Sedai. Any Aiel had. But that had ended yesterday, if not before. Good news. I'd give almost anything to have Galena, but still, good news. Rand touched the hilt of his sword again, eased the blade in its dark scabbard. The action seemed unconscious. Galena, a Red, had been in charge of the sisters who held him prisoner. And if he was calm about her today, yesterday he had been in a fury that she had gotten away. Even now his calm was icy, the sort that could hide smoldering rage. And his scent made Perrin's skin crawl. They are going to pay. Every one of them. There was nothing to say whether Rand meant the Shido or the Aes Sedai who had escaped, or both. Bera moved her head uneasily, and he turned his attention back to her and Karuna. You swore fealty, and I trust that. He held up his hand, thumb and forefinger nearly touching to show how far. Aes Sedai always know better than anybody else, or so they think. So I trust you to do what I say. But you won't so much as take a bath without my permission, or a wise one's. This time it was Bera who looked as though she had been struck. Her light brown eyes swiveled to Amis and Soralia with astonished indignation, and Karuna quivered with the effort of not doing the same. The two wise ones merely shifted their shawls, but once again their aromas were identical. Contentment rolled off them in waves, a very grim contentment. Perrin thought it a good thing the Aes Sedai did not have his nose, or they would have been ready to go to war right then and there. Or maybe run, and dignity be hanged. That was what he would have done. Ruark stood there idly examining the point of one of his short spears. This was Wise One's business, and he always said he did not care what the Wise Ones did, so long as they kept their fingers out of Clan Chief's business. But Taim, he made a show of not caring, folding his arms and looking around the camp with a bored expression. Yet his scent was strange, complex. Perrin would have said the man was amused, definitely in a better humor than before. The oath we took, Bera said at last, planting her hands on her ample hips, is sufficient to hold anyone but a dark friend. The twist she gave to oath was almost as bleak as the one she gave dark friend. No, they did not like what they had sworn to. Do you dare to accuse us? If I thought that, Rand snapped, you would be on your way to the Black Tower with Taim. You swore to obey. Well, obey! For a long moment, Bera hesitated. Then in an instant was as regal from head to toe as any Aes Sedai could be. Which was saying something. An Aes Sedai can make a queen on her throne look a slattern. She curtsied slightly, stiffly inclining her head a fraction. Karuna, on the other hand, made a visible effort to take hold of herself, the calm she assumed hard and brittle as her voice. Must we then request permission of these worthy Aiel women to ask whether you are willing to be healed yet? I know Galena treated you harshly. I know you are welts from shoulders to knees. Accept healing, please. Even please sounded part of an order. Min stirred at Rand's side. You should be grateful for it as I was, sheepherder. You don't like hurting. Somebody has to do it, or else. She grinned mischievously, very nearly the Min Perrin remembered from before she was kidnapped. Or else you won't be able to sit a saddle. Young men and fools, Mandera said suddenly to no one in particular, sometimes bear pain they do not have to as a badge of their pride and their foolishness. The Kara Karn, Sulin added dryly, also to the air, is not a fool, I think. Rand smiled back at Min fondly and gave Mandera and Sulin wry looks, but when he raised his eyes to Karuna again, they were stone once more. Very well. As she started forward, he added, but not from you. Her face grew so stiff it appeared ready to crack. Taim's mouth quirked in a wry, almost smile, and he stepped toward Rand, but without taking his eyes from Karuna, Rand flung out a hand behind him. From her. Come here, Alana. Rand gave a start. Rand had pointed straight to Alana with never so much as a glance. That prickled something in the back of his head, but he could not make out what. It seemed to catch Taim as well. The man's face became a bland mask, yet dark eyes flickered between Rand and Alana, and the only name Perrin could put to the scent that writhed in his nose was puzzled. Alana gave a start too. For whatever reason, she had been on edge ever since joining Perrin on his way here, her serenity at best a thin veneer. Now she smoothed her skirts, shot a defiant stare at Karuna and Bera, of all people, and glided around in front of Rand. The other two sisters watched her, like teachers intending to make sure a pupil performed well, and still not convinced she would. Which made no sense. One of them might be the leader, yet Alana was Aes Sedai, the same as they. It all deepened Perrin's suspicion. Mixing with Aes Sedai was too much like wading the streams in the waterwood near to the mire. However peaceful the surface, currents beneath could snatch you off your feet. More undercurrents seemed to appear here every moment, and not all from the sisters. Shockingly, Rand cupped Alana's chin, turning her face up. There was a hiss of indrawn breath from Bera, and for once Perrin agreed. Rand would not have been so forward with a girl at a dance back home, and Alana was not a girl at a dance. Just as surprising, her reaction was a blush and smell of uncertainty. Aes Sedai did not blush in Perrin's experience, and they were never uncertain. Heal me, Rand said, a command, not a request. The red in Alana's face deepened. Anger touched her scent. Her hands trembled as she reached out to take his head between them. Unconsciously, Perrin rubbed the palm of his hand, the one Ashaido's spear had laid open yesterday. Karuna had healed several gashes in him, and he had had healing before, too. It felt like being plunged headfirst into a freezing pond. Shaking in weak need. Too, usually. The only sign Rand gave was a slight shiver. How do you stand the pain? Alana whispered at him. It's done then, he said, removing her hands, and turned from her without a word of thanks. Seeming on the point of speaking, he paused, half turning to look back toward Demise Wells. They have all been found, Randolph Thor, Amis said gently. He nodded, then again, more briskly. It's time to be gone. Sorilea, will you name wise ones to take over the prisoners from the Ashaman? And also as companions for Karuna and my other liege women. For an instant he grinned. I wouldn't want them to err through ignorance. It shall be done as you say, Kara Karn. Adjusting her shawl firmly, the leather-faced wise one addressed the three sisters. Join your friends until I can find someone to hold your hands. It was not unexpected that Bera would frown indignantly or Karuna become frost personified. Alana gazed at the ground, resigned, almost sullen. Sorilea was having none of it. Clapping her hands sharply, she made brisk shooing motions. Well, move! Move! Reluctantly, the Aes Sedai let themselves be herded, making it seem they simply were going where they wished. Joining Soralia, Anice whispered something that Perrin did not quite catch. The three Aes Sedai apparently did, though. They stopped dead. Three very startled faces looking back at the Wise Ones. Soralia just clapped her hands again, louder than before, and shooed even more briskly. Scratching his beard, Perrin met Ruel.
All right, everyone. I'm going to call into his life for tonight. I want to thank Aaron for stopping by, and everyone keep stopping by and chilling with me. I definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.